there's something wrong with these calculations. But then the next question is, but is the thing that he's trying to say still accurate despite the math being wrong? And that tends to be then the follow-up question.
So we were talking a little bit about Doug, and I had Doug on the podcast. It's got to be a couple months ago now. And I know he's obviously been around for a very long time. He competed many years ago, and even I think somewhat recently, good physique. But there's definitely been controversy over his, I guess, what he is purporting to be the best way to lift. And I know when I had him on my own podcast, there were certain things that I questioned and certain rebuttals I would have. Although there is a fine line, I think, as a host between, you want to maybe push back, but you don't want to debate the guest so much. So I considered having him back on to discuss some of these points. But I know that you have, I think, quite a few points that you disagree with him on. So I don't know if you have maybe like an order that you want to start with or you want to address.
I mean, we can start with kind of like foundationals, and with most people in the industry, like, really, like, once you get to a certain level, most people, it's like, well, it's an agree, disagree. And sometimes it's like, we all agree on the same principles, but then the nuances in application, those principles, or how important those things are, or where maybe the most divergent thoughts are. So if we can agree that, one of the goals of Doug's methods is Doug is trying to promote being efficient with your training, right? And he defines efficiency as trying to load the muscle the most with the least amount of external load, if we want to really simplify that. And I think that's a valid pursuit, in that, if we're trying to target a tissue, we want to be efficient, but we also need to be realist and understand that that's not like an infinite point, meaning that the goal is not to figure out how to load my spine 0 or how to load everything else 0. It's really just, how do I make the thing that I'm targeting biased enough that is actually the thing that is going to cause failure in that exercise? It is the limiter. It's where the majority of the stimulus goes. And the degree that you need to bias or isolate something may vary on the goal. So in terms of the principle of like having the knowledge to be able to say, hey, if I take this person's squat and we heel elevate them, that might move it towards a little bit more quad bias. But if we move them to hack squat, that might be a little bit more. But none of those will be as biased as a leg extension. And just understanding that principle, I think, is very valuable. But thinking that, well, because a leg extension or a sissy squat only moves the knee and every lower body push also loads the hip, that somehow that the complete knee isolation exercises are the only good ones, or they're the vastly superior ones, I think that's, we'll say, lacking nuance and context for sure. And definitely, isn't always going to be the case for the goal. And, while we're on that subject, I would be like, hey, why not both, right? Why not do hack squats and leg extensions, or whatever it may be. I try and steel man that position as much as possible, because we teach very similar things in terms of biomechanics. We teach like, okay, this is a muscle's fully lengthened and fully shortened position. And basically, if we want to train a muscle, it makes sense that if we wanted to target it more specifically, we would try and move in a path that was closest to its, from its lengthened to shortened position. Not the same as origin insertion. And we can, get into where there's some issues with that thought process. Mm-hmm. But we also tell people like, this exists in a continuum, meaning that if I show you how to do an exercise that really moves in the path of the clavicular pec fibers, an exercise that doesn't do that perfectly is not 0 clavicular pec, right? Or it's not inherently bad, because there may be somebody that's like, look, I need one chest exercise, so I need it to do a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And there might be somebody else that's like, no, I'm going to do 6 chest exercises this week. And so it's probably more important that their exercises selection not be redundant, that they'd actually, all of their exercises have specific complementary goals. So from that principle perspective of, hey, we should know how to do things more efficiently, and we should be cognizant of how to shift the resistance or shift the work that's being done in an exercise, towards the goal that we want, whether that be isolation or whether that be spreading the load out amongst the tissue. But where I start to disagree with Doug, and probably the questions that I get the most, because I'm in the education space, so we have a lot of students, and those students, they've taken some physics, they've taken some anatomy, they've taken mechanics, or they've actually taken our actual courses. Will be one is just the way that Doug kind of calculates the physics to make some of his arguments. And I mean, there really isn't a way to butter it up that it's just wrong. So the example that is readily available on YouTube would be when he compares the squat, he looks at the tibia angle, and as he does the same thing on the dip. And basically, he's using the tibia angle and using the percentage of degrees, basically from 0 to 90, the percentage of that, and qualifying what he uses as a magnitude or magnification, I think is the way he says it. That it's like, okay, if the shin is 30 degrees forward, then he says that has a magnification of 33%. And I think the point that he would be trying to make would be is that maybe the knee had moved maybe like a third of the way as far forward as it could go. Unfortunately, like if you've been educated in physics, we would not calculate that distance. Like we would use what's called a moment arm, which is basically just the distance from the axis to where, the perpendicular line of the resistance. So in a squat, line of resistance is basically wherever the center of your mass is. That includes your barbell, your torso, your head, all of that. It's just a straight line towards the ground. And so if you want to know how much load is going on your quad, it's really simple. The further your knee moves horizontally away from that point, the more it's working. But because our body moves in arcs, we can't use like a tibia angle as a way of calculating that, right? We would literally just look at the distance and say, okay, well, what percentage of, the femur length or whatever, like, is really, in something like a squat, we have to balance, meaning center mass is always going to be over midfoot. So our goal is like, hey, if there's a strategy for me to get that knee further away, which in most cases is a heel elevation, or switching to an exercise that doesn't require balance, like a hack squat or a pendulum squat or something like that, those are ways that we can increase force around the knee. Now, the way Doug does the math, unfortunately, it's wrong. So he's looking at the first 30% of the tibia moving forward. We move in arcs. So if you imagine the top of a circle, right, and you were to be like at the very top of a circle and you were to start sloping down, you move mostly horizontally, right? So when we move in an arc, we don't move in the same perspective every degree that we go in that arc. We actually would move horizontally more. So when we're at 30 degrees, we're actually getting closer to about 50% of as far as we could go forward. So when we actually do the math on Doug's actual picture that he uses, and I'm thinking about posting some images of this on my YouTube, if we can coordinate those, so that those links could be available for you guys so you have visuals for this, because it's always hard to talk about this stuff, that's very visually dominant. But it's off by, I believe in that example, by about 25%. And then he does the same thing for the tricep dips, where he says, well, since the forearm is at a 10-degree angle, which is 11% of 90, that he says, well, okay, that's, 11% magnification. And because, again, as an arc starts, it moves more horizontal and then it moves more vertical as it becomes closer to horizontal. That's so horizontally dominant that it's actually off by almost double. So actually the amount of load that we get on the tricep in a dip is twice as much what Doug claims. And the amount that we're getting in that squat example is about, 150% of what Doug is claiming. Now, he's still moving in the right direction in those examples, but when you start fudging numbers that are off by an order of magnitude of 100% or 50%, right, and you're making claims like this is absolute truth because it's physics, I'm like, well, I believe in physics too, but I believe in physics that's based off of solid math.
Right.
So that's my, those are some of the questions I get firstly, is like, okay, there's something wrong with these calculations. But then the next question is, but is the thing that he's trying to say still accurate despite the math being wrong? And that tends to be then the follow-up question, because I don't think it's fair just to go around and like picking, apart people's math. Just like, hey, if somebody says something really good, but they make a grammatical error in it, then I don't think that invalidates their argument per se. Right. So same thing here. So
I would also, not to like I agree with that general principle. However, I would say if somebody was trying to provide me, like going to the grammar example, if somebody was trying to provide me an intellectual argument and their grammar was just horrible, at some point it would invalidate it to me. And if somebody's entire argument is, well, this is physics and science and math, and they aren't doing basic calculations correctly, that inherently just invalidates a lot of the arguments and makes me more suspect about future arguments.
I absolutely agree that it's damaging to the credibility, but I wouldn't oppose somebody on those facts alone, right? Sure. If that makes sense. So it's like, if I was like, hey, what he's saying makes sense, but because he made a mistake, I'm not going to just default to like, well, but he must be wrong because he made a mistake in his math or spelling or whatever, right? If that were the case, I would be wrong a lot because I don't spell check like the majority of the posts that I write, and I have fat thumbs and I'm walking the dog and whatever. So just like, so maybe I'm biased because I'm like, just please forgive me for being completely negligent in most of the stuff I post on social media. But anyway,